have the opportunity to really give the platform for the artists to speak tonight. We know that we are all living in strange and surreal times where this would have once been a big celebratory gathering of artist talks in the gallery itself. But due to COVID, we are now sort of populating this forum. And I think it's as exciting for Tyler and I as the audience to be able to have this conversation with the artists. And so I want to first of all thank all of them for being here. We have the pleasure of having 10 of the 15 artists in the Carriers exhibition with us tonight. And so I also want to thank those artists who couldn't join us tonight. That's Michael Ray Charles, Vincent Valdez, Dario Robleto, Lovey Olivia, and Pritika Rajgaraya for participating in this really fascinating and poignant exhibition. And so the format for the evening is that Tyler and myself, are going to give a general overview of the exhibition. So we're going to take about 10 minutes, just run through a few installation photos and give everyone the larger thesis and inspiration for the exhibition. And then after that, we are going to hand it off to the artists. And so Tyler and myself will take turns and alternate introductions, and then we will give each of the artists about 10 minutes to speak. I know it's not a lot, but just, since we have kind of this format and this evening, we're going to kind of keep it running. But we want to encourage all of you that if you've not yet seen the exhibition, this is the final week. The exhibition will be up until March 14th. We are always free. Please make a reservation online. You really need to see this exhibition in person. And we hope that if you have seen it, this will just illuminate it more. And if you haven't, this will be the catalyst for you to see the exhibition. So I think at this point, maybe Amanda, we can start looking at some images, and we will give you the introduction. So maybe Tyler, I'll let you kind of start to speak about it a little bit, and then we can sort of all tag team on this part.
Sure. Hello, everyone. We're so thrilled, like Steven mentioned, to have a handful or a majority of the artists with us this evening. As many of you might know, the Blaffer for many years had this great tradition of hosting a Houston area exhibition. And in the sort of wake of the pandemic and shifts in our own sort of internal calendars for exhibitions and programs, Steven and I were thinking about a way to create an exhibition that engages and brings us together in a way that sort of only local presentations of working with artists from next door in our community around the Houston area can happen. So the sort of nexus of the exhibition, which is called Carriers, the body as a site of danger and desire, is thinking about the body as this dual place, this sort of paradoxical place, both in the wake of the pandemic, thinking of it as this sort of literal carrier, if you will, of this life-threatening virus. And then also, of course, in the last year, amidst the sort of renewed reckoning over social justice and race relations in the United States, we wanted to think too about the ways that the body becomes this literal place for discussion, destruction, violence. And so that really, between these two sort of larger themes, those became the sort of prevailing ideas that led to us thinking about how we might create an exhibition that explores this sort of variety of complex issues.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler. And I'll just sort of add in that, I think that we wanted to respond to the moment, but we didn't want to do it in such a dour way, because we all know that we have immense COVID fatigue, that everyone is sort of desiring the end that, seems to be sort of the light at the end of the tunnel. And so we thought about, but we wanted to be responsive and reflective. And so we thought about this exhibition as a place of catharsis. And as Tyler mentioned, the duality of what the body represents in the moment, the idea that we are longing for the human contact that we once took for granted in this place of alienation and isolation when we need to be fearful of one another and socially distanced. We long for that intimacy and that contact. And yet we now need to be wary and afraid of one another because we might be asymptomatic, or we could be carrying a form of this disease and not even know it. And so we wanted to look at that dichotomy and that ambivalence through this work. And what you're going to see is that actually a number of the works, the large majority, were not created in direct response to COVID-19 or even afterwards. Really, we were gathering a number of works that were created well in advance of the pandemic. The earliest piece is by Vincent Valdez that was made in 2003. But we thought that by bringing all of this work together in this particular circumstance, it opened up new readings and understandings of the work. And in contrast to that, this work allowed us to see this moment in a different way. And you're also going to see that the number of artists that we wanted to represent, we really wanted to go across the range and have very established artists as well as emerging artists in conversation with one another. But as Tyler highlighted, we wanted this to be sort of seen through a Houston lens and a Houston perspective, because obviously the pandemic experience is different for everyone around the world. But we felt that this kind of grounded this particular reflection in the local.
Certainly. And then I also just sort of wanted to briefly add that thinking about this notion of the body, which has so many sort of different possible references or interpretations or ways of depicting different issues, that led us to also then think about some larger ideas that sort of become different through lines throughout the exhibition. So you'll see in Carriers, which is both located on the first floor and the second floor of the Blaffer, the works that we have included of the artists that will speak here tonight, and we mentioned that there are 15 total. It becomes about this larger idea of how does the body speak to a variety of issues that range from personal narratives and intimate stories, or some of the artists' own biographies within these sort of larger, broader themes of representation, of health, obviously, of labor, of sexuality, and of gender. So this really becomes sort of a rich site and also an opportunity for all of us, those who visit the museum, as well as those of us who work at the museum, as we think about interpreting and what does it mean to show the art of our time. It provides an opportunity to sort of take a look at what is happening in Houston right now as well.
And I have to say, just as maybe a final note, that we are just so grateful to the artists to have this opportunity. One of my professors in graduate school compared a group exhibition to a dinner party, where you have the opportunity to invite a number of interesting people that you like around a dinner table and just let them have a conversation. And I think that Tyler and I had it was a really sort of enlightening opportunity to be able to position these works in these spaces and to see the conversations that start to emerge and sort of come out of the positioning of the work. This is a great example right here of Dario Robledo next to j.bilhan with Sarah Sudhoff's performance video next to it, creating this kind of mini triptych of works that really start to speak to one another in a really direct way. And so I think that you can only experience that in person. You can draw a million floor plans and sort of see everything on paper, but when the work lives in the space, these beautiful sort of dialogues start to emerge. So maybe with that, we're now at 6:15. So I think now it's the opportunity to hand it over to the artists. And for this particular evening, we thought rather than read a bunch of bios, and kind of cut into the time, we are going to post the bios into the chat. And then we are also going to list bios and headshots of the artists on our website afterwards, so that if you want to read more about the background, you will have the opportunity to do so. But tonight we thought that Tyler and I would introduce more in terms of what drew us to the particular artists and why we chose their work. And so I have the pleasure of speaking to Francis Almendárez's work. And I first had the opportunity to see Francis's work at the Jonathan Hobson Gallery in a small two-person show curated by Deborah Barrera. And I was just so struck by Francis's beautiful ability to weave very sincere, kind of fragile, intimate, personal reflections, observations, experiences with much larger currents, much larger sort of theoretical bodies. And just that sort of connection. Francis's work just feels so sincere. And so, the more research we did, he had up the opportunity to do a residency at Art Pace in San Antonio. And we saw this expansion of his work into this sort of mode of installation. And so the choices for the exhibition is that we wanted to look at some of Francis's early work and then connect it to one of his most recent pieces. And you're going to see that Francis works quite a bit with textiles, with clothing, with sort of found used clothing. And we were struck by this as sort of this ghostly residue of lives lived, of bodies inhabited. And then the way that that bridges into his most recent piece, Rhythm and Pleasure, where he's looking at the movements of the body, both in sort of places of dance as well as manual labor, and looking at sort of the language as it migrates between these different modes of experience. So I'm going to hand it off to Francis now. Francis, we kind of queued it up so that you could speak first about the earliest work, the textile-based work, and then move into the installation.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the wonderful introduction. And thanks everybody for tuning in. I'm so pleased to be a part of this and to have these works in the exhibition, but also like have an older work paired with more recent work. And it made me realize there are these things that are connecting them that perhaps I wouldn't have seen so directly if it weren't for you to ask me to contribute this to the exhibition. But I'm very glad that you did ask me to bring this, because it was in the closet, just folded up, kind of just, in the back burner for so long. But the clothes definitely were part of my process, or sewing and working with clothes directly were part of my process that was kind of put in the back burner and then resurfaced when I did have that opportunity to create an installation. And for me, the piles of clothes and the palettes become this sort of stand-in for the body, like you mentioned, and I'm using them to allude to the circulation of people or the migration of people and their communities, and who they move from place to place, offering up their bodies and their labor. And by extension, that includes the circulation of culture. And I'm thinking about how culture is then consumed, appropriated, co-opted, repackaged, and resold. And on the one hand, I'm interested in these objects, and not just the clothes, but the palettes as well, for their corporeal properties and their association to the working class. So if you look closely, you'll see that there's wear and tear in a lot of the clothes, but also in a lot of the palettes. Some of the clothes are inside out in the same way that you see in the painting. And, it's again referencing labor and the manufacturing of these clothes, that whole process from design to fabrication, to then, going to retail shops, to then being worn by workers, and then, over time getting wear and tear, and then being discarded or donated, or resold back to the global south, as bulk. So on the other hand, I'm also interested in these objects as symbolic of the accumulation of wealth and resources, or of mass consumerism, or of greed and prejudice, and how the circulation of objects or commodities are privileged over human lives and the environment, right? So there's an abundance of wealth and resources, yet Black and Brown communities don't see any of it because it's hoarded by the elite. Of course, we know this, but and they control, the means of production, the media apparatus. And so these systems of value, which are designed to exclude, suppress, and depreciate the labor of our communities, the production of our communities, of our BIPOC communities. And so that being said, I really in the space that I'm in, I was really grateful to be sharing that space with the artists, Jasmine Zelaya and Michael Ray Charles and Violette Bule. And it was really nice to see, the dialogue that was happening between my work and theirs. And how we all collectively in our own different ways address the misrepresentation or the invisibility of Black communities, women of color, and immigrants. And so for me, it's very important to counter these dominant stereotypes and negative depictions that circulate in the same way that all these other circulations are happening through the mainstream media, right? And to reframe the conversation, to flip the discourse, to pose questions, and and have that go along with these images that are in the video that portray these communities as, with dignity, portray these images of joy and these images of pleasure, right? And in these communities of color having the right to have pleasure and to have leisure, which, leisure is often excluded from them. Leisure is only afforded to privileged bodies, right? So that's kind of what's happening in the work. It's in the films themselves. You get a tour. It starts off in the countryside, and then we progress and move into the city. And as you progress, there are the tempos and the rhythms speed up, and the different types of labor also change. You begin with like farming and teaching and domestic labor, cooking and sweeping, to then in the city, once you get to the city, you have the mass production of tortillas, or the making of counterfeit Nike shoes. And then eventually you get to people performing music and dance and singing, and essentially like I'm not introducing, but like reframing the conversation around cultural production as actually being labor and as having educational value. And then of course, like this whole concept of like the body being an actual archive itself, right? Through which ideas and history and narratives, everything is transmitted through and passed down from generation to generation through our bodies. So yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Francis. If I may, we just have a couple more minutes, but I wanted to ask you, another through line that I found was sort of the idea of the performance of identity as a form of labor unto itself. And I was performance in such a way that I mean that you take those found for denim and garments and you stretch them into the form of a painting, which we see as a particular object of value, that lives in a museum. In the same way that you talk even about dance as this sort of idea of labor, in that it's a performance of identity, in depending on context. And I was struck by that, and I was hoping you could just maybe speak a little to that in terms of the translation of these clothing into an artwork.
Yeah, definitely. I love that you brought that up, because it's often, a struggle I have myself and working in multidisciplinary ways, right? And one of the things when I was a student, it's like, where's everybody? Everyone was like trying to be a painter, and I was kind of like the outsider. And wait, why does everyone want to be a painter? And so like I took classes and I learned, and I realized very quickly, like after, it was very difficult to learn. Of course, it takes a lot of talent and work. But then I realized, like, no, this isn't for me. It's not what I want to do. But it kind of felt like I was just there to kind of fit in, or try to fit in. And so I thought it was funny, like that the here I bring these discarded clothes and like sew them together and stretch them as if they were a canvas, and in a way also trying to fit into this, the art historical canon, or just into, bringing that, there's that, but also like bringing in this language, or this process of like not art, which is like sewing. It's not really art, or it's like, I guess, craft, or just bringing that kind of visual and material language into the conversation of art, and what what happens in that shift, right? And I'm interested in that shift and in shifting that conversation. And it's really exciting to see how things have changed from 10 years ago to now, and even 10 years ago, like the conversation had shifted from 10 years before that. And so it's, yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question, but yeah, I like this idea of like trying to assert yourself or insert yourself, and in some ways it can be performative totally.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much, Francis. So now I think I will hand it off to Tyler to introduce our next artist.
Jay, you're up. It's my pleasure to briefly introduce j.bilhan, who, Steven and I first came to know Jay's work. It's now been, I think, coming up on a year and a half ago, whenever we were thrilled to invite Jay and his co-curator for Mike Steven for this program in fall of 2019, which feels like a lifetime ago, for an evening of performances called Everyone at Blaffer. And I have just been a fan of Jay's photographs for a long time. And so this was quite the nice opportunity to think about what does it mean to sort of bring some of these photographs of yours from the series that you've been working on for several years called Variable Embrace into the context of an exhibition about the body. And then just very briefly, so we've included 4 images from the series in the exhibition. And the photographs are intimate views of Jay's relationships with different friends and lovers whose ages differ from his. And in the context of our exhibition, I want to read this quick little quote from Jay, and then I'll let you speak properly, Jay. But I just think this is really lovely. With each new image, he says, I'm attempting to channel some form of love. I'm paying respect to the men, young and old, who drift in the fringes with their age-gapped affection/affliction. Jay, I wonder if you could tell us about this body of work and how it relates to your larger practice, and then also perhaps about your ideas of depicting and visualizing joy, desire, and love. You're muted still.
Okay, here we are. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tyler, for the introduction. Yeah, this work is, it's taken a few years now. I started in 2018 and have been collecting photographs ever since. And I think maybe some kind of end is in sight in the next couple of years. But I thought the selection here was interesting because the project itself, Variable Embrace, is this focus on the idea of an intergenerational relationship. Started from my own, I say, affliction and affection to older men. And then I've just grown it into this sort of sociological exploration and investigation. But in the 4 that you chose, they're all depicting just the older man himself in solitude or alone in the frame, rather than showing that relationship to the younger body. And so it is interesting to see that, where the viewer of the work is then invited to look at the older man's body in the way that, say, I would, or someone else who's attracted to them. So this is like, I've created these images as a form of appreciation and respect, and now the viewer is invited to focus directly on that body as well. How it relates to the exhibition, I think, is it's interesting. There are a lot of social stigmas associated to this project, and associated to myself in general, my own relationship to these older men, to older men in general. Young people having relationships with old people, old as in like over the age of 40, 50, not really old in that kind of derogatory sense, but matured. These things are looked down upon in some way. And outside of my own relationship with mature people, I've met other young people who had platonic friendships with older people, and I found these relationships to be just as interesting to me. But yeah, this has a lot of sociological implication in that, you know, younger people are stigmatized for being with older, and vice versa. I think there's a lot of I guess, desire and danger in that way, like the title of the show. And so this was a really interesting selection from both of you, Tyler and Steven. So I appreciate that that connection, that desire and danger is a really great juxtaposition in this case.
Yeah. Thanks. I wonder, you know, when you're making these pictures, of what sort of first drew you, because you've been making them, I think, what for since
2018.
20. Okay. What was the sort of first inclination for this to become sort of an ongoing series rather than, you know, this sort of you know, memento of a sort of a relationship or a tryst or you know, just a sort of fleeting moment? I mean, this has become a sort of more formal body of work for you. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I guess I couldn't really call it a tryst because it isn't. This is perhaps a pillar of my own identity in my own life at this point. My relationships to older men are not novel. These are things that exist perhaps as a permanent state within my life. It began as a catharsis in a way, as my own way of reckoning with this thing that I found so horrible when I was young. Growing up in Texas and also in religious communities, I was not okay with it for a long time. And often you'll hear this idea that, like, for us, the younger person, or perhaps even the mature partner, there's this double process of coming out of the closet. There's the reckoning with the being gay or whatever, queer, and then the second aspect of that is allowing that affection of older people to be a public image.
Mm-hmm.
Walking down the street holding your lover's hand and your lover happens to be 40 years older than you is not a very light experience, especially when there are so many different views and eyes that watch that kind of thing. And it's strange because in itself, it's a very, I mean, it's not at all strange. In itself, it's very normal, very beautiful. Intimacy between two people, in any case, love, as we call it, or romance, these are really beautiful ideas. And it's interesting how that kind of idea has been more or less partitioned into this like young heterosexual kind of narrative. And then I guess over the past several years with all of the civil rights movements, now we do have a bit of a more mainstream acceptable package of queer love or LGBT love, but this kind of thing still does kind of exist on a fringe.
Yeah.
Jay, can I just ask Jay quickly? I know we're kind of at the end of our time, but for me, one of the most striking contrasts, and I think I'm seeing your work. Prior to coming to Houston, I worked in the CAC in Cincinnati, where Robert Mapplethorpe was such a continuing influence. You know, his legacy, the way that he saw his subjects. And I see in your work the striking contrast where we see, you know, oftentimes there is sort of injury, or oftentimes there might be a kind of implied or nascent violence there kind of present, but you have such a classical aesthetic, like such a kind of a sculptural stillness. And I was wondering how you kind of came to that place, you know, in terms of sort of seeing these subjects through that lens.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Well, I think that element of nascent violence is an intuitive element. I don't think it was not intentional up until this image of the man sitting in the chair. The man sitting in the chair was an intentional symbolism. Any of the ones that came before that were completely unintentional symbolism. I think about it in this way. My own body is like a 25-year-old person. It's like I'm very slim and like young. And so in this way, it's like a kind of young, beautiful thing. But then I have these tattoos on my body. And in a way, I see those tattoos as being this kind of graffiti or defacement. I read something a while ago about this foundation was doing renovations on the Parthenon and adding on a museum, all of this kind of stuff. And during those renovations, street artists would go and put graffiti on the Parthenon. And so I think about this as, again, a sociological element of there is always this kind of nascent violence, this underlying inherent violence within this human machine and this human factor. The Parthenon with the graffiti on it being, I think, a perfect example.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
So now I have the opportunity to introduce our next artist, Violette Bule. And I was first introduced to Violette through a studio visit at her studio in Box 13, and just was really fascinated, I think, by Violette's work in terms of her language of materiality. And then, about a year later, she had a very kind of resonant installation at the TransArt Foundation. And Violette's interested in, I think what Tyler and I especially were drawn to in the context of this exhibition was the way that she translates that materiality into questions around labor, and particularly sort of objects that become avatars and surrogates for the bodies that they interact with and represent. And so we were really struck by sort of the power of her sculptural pieces, and had the opportunity for Violette to be in the space to recreate two pieces that we had seen, but that she kind of reinvented for the Blaffer. And so I want to now sort of hand it off to her to let her speak more to those materials in the context of sort of how they speak to the subjects that they represent.
Thank you, Steven, and thank you, Tyler. Thank you, everyone, for being here and for this amazing and unique opportunity. I was hearing what Francis said about the connection of the pieces in the same room, and one of the things that I am more grateful is the huge image that it's created around my work now after this installation. It's like the meaning of the work is it's getting bigger and bigger after this. So I want to say that my work is insisting in translate my personal experience, surviving not only as an immigrant but also as a woman of color, and all these pieces are trying to share history or a story, or also give us the opportunity to talk about things that are invisible, taking that Francis' word again. So another thing that I want to say is that I have been moving from one city to another. So these pieces are been traveling with me. And then last time I went to New York to bring another piece of the homage to Johnny, that is the one with the forks. So let's say that these pieces are like animals that are living and became other things and saying more stuff, and also like right now after this exhibition is getting another like I said, another layer of meaning in each of it. So let's say that I'm going to say that a little bit about the story of each of the pieces. In this case, is the homage to Johnny, that it's an artwork that pay homage of one of my co-workers at a restaurant that I used to work in New York. And the thing is that he was the one who was paid less because he couldn't speak Spanish or English, because he was from Mexico and he is Nahuatl, so he only speak Nahuatl. And I always, seen him working, cleaning all the silverware of the restaurant, and he got paid like $5 per hour. So I don't know. I didn't had a chance to tell him that I was doing this piece for him, and I wanted to dream with that idea. If I can find him again and tell him, like, you inspire me to have this piece, and then this piece became the voice of a lot of people who work in the service to in a very difficult and complex situations to survive and so on. So I'm interested in the dynamics of and the dynamic of the we do to survive as an immigrants. And my work is connected with art and labor, and I always trying to present these pieces to like a chance to spark the conversation and talk about the situation, and also to talk about the not only my own experience, but also the way the people have connection with. This is the original doors that I found outside a door of a restaurant that was in construction. They were renewing everything, so I was able to recycling the pieces to create the doors, and also the magnets that the sculpture have. It's also recycling magnets. And I remember that the person who was collecting the magnets for me to dismantling from speakers, his name is also Johnny too, and he came from Haiti. So it's, I don't know, at a moment in my life when I was working with this sculpture, I was connecting with a lot of Johnny's guys that were helping me to create this. So, and then Dream America, it's a piece that I did when another coworker, she was a person who took my position when I left. And this work is inspired in the work of August Sander. And he created an archive of the people who survived after the World War II. And I got inspired by the way he collect and trying to present the identity of all those survivors. And if I'm talking as a Venezuelan, we are living kind of I will not say in a Holocaust or something like that, but we are living in a very extreme situation. And my friend, she had to left the country because she couldn't get any paper to stay. So also for language problems, she only got the position of a bus runner because she couldn't pay the service as a waitress. So I asked her to pose for me with this picture. And then I have the sculpture. This is not gold, which is the soap sculpture. And the first connection that I have with this was the smell. I remember when I went to this place to buy something, and then I remember that I got the smell of the soap, and I remember the same smell from the same kind of soap in Venezuela. We have the same, and then when I look at the soap, the name was Hispano, and the slogan of the soap was quality of people who keep improving. So for me, it was like a weird connection. I'm very interested in that revolving door that is creating through the labor and improving in a way of get more stuff, get more things, and then that's the way that you can show other people that you're improving because you have a bigger car, or you have the last version of an iPhone and so on. So the way that we are improving through the service, the way that we are working in the border, working in Ciudad Juarez, and working the maquilas, and then all sometimes family are here buying the stuff they're finalized producing in those maquilas, and then you buy the product and then you send it back to Latin America. So I'm very curious about that, and I was trying to do a wink with this, the stairs, the pyramid that you're trying to clean is the way of the Hispanic people is trying to to reach the dream, and then that's a slippery stairs that sometimes you have to step in the head of the other in order to be able to reach the dream. So another thing that I wanted to say now that I'm sorry, you said something about materiality and then I went all over. But what I wanted to say is that I like to work with precarious materials. So I like to work with objects that are inviting to people to touch, to smell, to in a way the precarious became organic and became in other things, other possibilities. I like to recycling and not only ideas and comments of other people. Like for example, the first time that I exhibit the This Is Not Gold, the smell was a connector with the spectator because people from other Latin American country, also Spain, were caught by the same nostalgia through the smell because we all have the same soap but with a different name. So the recycling is something that matters to me, and then also the forks are part of that recycling. The co-workers or friends that they always bring me a gift when we met, and instead of give me a bottle of wine, they bring me forks and so on. So it's kind of things that are growing by the experience, growing by the opportunity that I have every time that I have a chance to exhibit the work. And
Thank you so much, Violette. I know we have to hand it off to the next artist, but I just wanted to kind of conclude by quickly saying that you've done this work that really kind of, I think, shines a light on hidden labor that really is in so many ways the architecture of society. And I just wanted to let our audience know that Violette is doing this photo series of a number of healthcare workers that are involved now in the struggle against COVID. And we ultimately didn't include it in this show, but I just want to say like that how moving that effort is, and to just let everyone know that that we'll see the light in a future iteration. But just to thank you, Violette, for your work and everything that you're doing.
Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Violette. The next artist that we are discussing is Ryan Hawk, and we're really glad that Ryan is able to join us. I believe Steven and I were first both introduced to Ryan's work from his time as a core fellow. And luckily for us, Ryan has decided to stick around in Houston. And in the context of this exhibition, Steven and I were both drawn to Ryan's ability to sort of make work that has this inherent ability to somehow simultaneously manage to intrigue, frighten, challenge us, and also simultaneously pull out a visceral response from viewers. And as we'll see in some of these images, Ryan's works across media often draw upon techniques and methodologies found in horror films, experimental films, as well as BDSM, as we can see in this image. And I apologize for the dog barking. You guys would not believe me if I told you there were 11 puppies immediately to my left. and as well as Ryan's interest in sort of depicting what does it mean to create and queer bodies to create an alternative corporeal reality, as he has described, and then also visualizing these sort of different forms of what embodiment can be. And I think more largely, of course, Ryan's work encourages us to think about deeply complex issues, about social hierarchies, race, sexuality, masculinity, certainly, and gender more broadly. So I'm very glad to hear from Ryan in this context. And I wonder, Ryan, if you could speak with us about how you choose to depict the bodies or depict bodies or bodily forms sort of broadly across your works.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone for being here and sharing. Yeah, I think, it probably makes sense to go off of the introduction by talking about the work in a kind of chronological sense in terms of the years that they were made. And this would be the earliest one within the works that are included in the exhibition that is part of a larger body of work and, a series of maybe 4 to 5 different video installations that were structured through this kind of appropriated methodology, or methodology that appropriated the structure of BDSM power relationships within the kind of context of my art practice. And it's called, the series is called Director / Subject or Foreplay, as in kind of another descriptor. And within these various videos, I would just kind of, or projects rather, I would post online, being kind of very forward in that I'm an artist and dom director looking for submissive subjects to participate in this project. And I would then kind of work with those who responded and design these situations based on both my own interest and their kind of fetishes or desires to be dominated. And so in some ways it's a collaboration. And in this video in particular, for those who haven't had the chance to see it, and what the kind of still frame doesn't show, is that there's a figure that is revealed slowly, and kind of slowly and also simultaneously very assertively and aggressively in the kind of picture plane. And it's this masculine figure, this kind of traditional masculine figure that he's in fact in a large latex vacuum bag. And so the video is just literally documenting this process of him being sucked tight in this bed, and then going away. Kind of it releases and it goes away, and it just kind of loops back and forth. And with this particular body of work, I at the time thought I was interested in kind of power in this broad sense, power and agency, notions of those things in a broader sense. And this is an interesting one to talk about in terms of like an evolution into other work of mine, and specifically in its address of notions of masculinity and what it means to kind of reorient or flip what we assume masculinity to be, and what kind of dominant cultural narratives assume masculinity to be, is to be like kind of active and aggressive. And then here this kind of subject is bound in a kind of passive submissive position that in fact has a lot of power. But something that you can't see in this this particular example in this larger project is how it relate. I kind of realized at some point that all of the subjects who were reaching out to me were of a particular demographic, and that demographic was middle to late aged and white. And I kind of started to think really seriously about that and problematize it, and in this notion of like has power or excess power and is willing to kind of step in and surrender that in these kind of situations. And if we could kind of go through, kind of help me wrap it up. I realize that we're getting close to time. I started to become interested in, considering masculinity through the larger structuring that is engendering forces, what it means to engender something, and even to bracket out even further is to its relationship to whiteness and white masculinity within these kind of same kind of cultural logic of what it assumes to be and how it kind of dominantly prescribes to other things. And this piece called Ulterior Subjects, I think to say really quickly is, really concerned with the ultimate problem of, the Western dialectic of like locating where to locate the self, this kind of split of kind of subject, object, animal, nature, and they go on forever. And these two figures or I call them figures, these two sculptures are these silicone masks that were made and kind of operated from behind, and they don't really line up. They're kind of not quite right is the language I like to use about them. And they're called ulterior subjects because it's intended to kind of both satirize this notion of the like the white universal self-determined subject who in spirit without body. It kind of locates him in this dilemma and this confrontation with the figure of the flesh, the figure of his own white flesh, and all the implications of what that means. And so that's kind of a way to say that I'm interested in addressing not just the body, not just the masculine body, but the white body, and as racialized, as marked, and against this kind of larger narrative that insisted it's not that thing. And that kind of speaks to the tattoo works that are included in the exhibition as well. And this piece, I don't know if we have time to do all of it, but in this work,
yeah. I was going to say, if we've included this work, if you just want to speak just for a second about it, we have time.
Yeah, I always do this. Sorry. So a vestige of the same. I was really interested in the figure of Frankenstein as a kind of ultimate trope of monstrosity, and this kind of speaks to what Tyler was saying in the introduction of my interest in subcultural kind of forms of expression and the way that monstrosity is always kind of figured outward, and it's taken up, in this kind of reclaimed in these narratives of those who are in the periphery of this otherwise dominant figure. So what I mean by that is in the way that kind of minorities across all sectors reclaim certain pejorative words, and so I was interested in kind of really locating the figure of the monster and all of it and all its connotations on through this kind of critique of white masculinity, but also in kind of deflating it in its kind of overusage, because Frankenstein is incredibly old, and it's in fact, and I'm doing an ear that or performing an ear that I often that the work is kind of invested in. It's that this is not actually Frankenstein, but it's actually Frankenstein's monster. And sorry if that wasn't clear, but I think I'll just kind of leave it there for now.
Oh, that's great. Thanks very much, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ryan. I wish, with all of the artists, I wish we had a full hour to go into. There's so many layers and sort of intricacies of the work, and really to experience Ryan's work in person. We left out some of the tattoo pieces, but the materiality is so present that you really do need to interact and experience with these pieces in person. I now have the pleasure of introducing our next artist, and we have come to know, I've been in Houston about 2 years now, the magnetic force and impresario that is Robert Hodge. You will get swept into it when you live in this city. Robert, I saw his work when he was one of the artists in residence at the Lawndale Art Center, and was just so taken by the breadth of his practice. He's an artist, he's a DJ, he's a musician, and he really weaves together so many of those elements into his practice. And I can say that Tyler and I were both very excited about this opportunity because there are so many references that Robert weaves together in his pieces that I think we are just sort of seeing the tip of the iceberg in the way that we were trying to access the work. He's sort of an archaeologist of popular culture in the way that he weaves together intercontinental references, art and music and politics and protest. And so I am just going to sit back and just enjoy this because Robert, we just want to hand it off to you and just allow us to access some of your thinking and the way that you weave together these images and references and indexes in this work.
Sure thing. Thank you for having me, Steven and Tyler. I really appreciate it. I got to see this show in person. It was really, really beautiful and thoughtful. And I'm honored to be among these artists here and anybody's watching. So thank you again for having me in the exhibition. So yeah, I'm gonna start by saying, like, I try to tell my story through any vehicle that I can use to probably tell a story effectively. So that's kind of why the practice jumps around from like paintings to collages to like film or music. I'm not the best at a lot of these things, but I'm still trying to push myself and I keep experimenting. And I think that's like, that is the most, if I have anything I'm really proud of, is like, I'm going to keep pushing the narrative of like, keep adding arsenal things to my belt. Because I know when I was just doing like one particular thing, I got really kind of stifled. I feel like I got really kind of bored and I really started asking myself, why am I an artist? And when I try something new, it kind of reminds me, because when you start something new, you start kind of really terribly and you have to build your way up to something decent. And so it kind of always is a humbling experience when you start over with a new technique. And so this painting we have here, I believe that's 72 by maybe 90, 96 something, but it was made in 2017 and it was part of the exhibition at the Station Museum. And the show was called Friendly Fire. And I found this really great photo, like from 1968, 1967, of these Black Panther kids, and they were just really like engulfing this sculpture that felt really like, this Caesar kind of European sculpture. The way they were so casual on it, like laying in the lap, and it was so much energy happening around the sculpture. I thought it was a perfect like synopsis of the story of what was happening at that time. And I thought it had the energy to just transfer into a painting. And so when I'm making these works, I'm also thinking about history, but I'm also thinking about how these old images still feel very prevalent and relevant today. Like they don't lose their intensity because they're in the 60s or the 50s. And in some ways that's really exciting, but in some ways it's terribly sad, because I feel like we're still going through these same narratives as humans that we should have been like transcended past, I'm still telling some things to my daughter that was told to me when I was a kid. And it's like, come on, guys, we're in 2021. And I'm really thinking the only way to really kind of mend this thing is like an alien invasion, and we understand that we're all on the same accord and we all kind of like, going through this life as best we can and navigating it. And so I really kind of used the fabric in this piece just to have a flow of things. And a lot of the works at this time kind of had these ties of different fabrics. And I was just like really speaking literally of a connection made through fabric and made through these ideas, because I think everything kind of connects. When I was really young, I read this book called Cracking Creativity, and it gave you a key word. And then from this word, you got to break down the word. And I realized how everything, like I said, was interconnected. Like nothing is really isolated. So you can make the connection to anything. And so for me, I make my work connected to images that I kind of want to reclaim. Not only reclaiming the material of like found like objects and reclaim paper and fabric, but also reclaiming narratives that I once read that I thought that it didn't give me enough information. And so I have people in my life that I thought were very powerful and very magnetic. And so I kind of want to introduce them into this form of like pop art, kind of fine art culture. And like a lot of stuff here that happened in Pittsburgh, like these two large ones happened in Pittsburgh. And so on the right is John Henry. And, and this show is Carries, and we speak about the body. And this guy literally sacrificed his body he was a railroad worker. He kind of like sacrificed his body to be the machine. He made this point that he was better than the machine, but it was at the cost of his life. And so at the top of that piece, you have George Clinton. To me, he represents the whole, to me, he's like the icon of Afrofuturism. Like this guy in the 70s wearing these wild costumes coming from a mothership. And he kind of gave me an example, like, you know, I tend to think about my sister, Alicia Wormsley in Pittsburgh, and she has this big billboard that says they're all Black people in the future. And that's what George Clinton did for me. He reminded me that I did exist, and what would we look like? How would we navigate that? And then I pulled from, like, you know, Rumble, Young Man Rumble from Muhammad Ali. So like I said, all these sources are being pulled as I'm doing this research and reading. I'm researching images, and then I get to be spontaneous. So I become like a jazz musician where, you know, when you're a jazz musician, you study the notes, you understand the music and the structure of being a musician. And then once you master that, you're able to be free in the studio and just record and break down, deconstruct the music. And, you know, and so that's kind of what I do with the images. I take them, I research these great narratives and stories, and my work becomes like a large scale journal that I'm just translating information as I absorb it, and I just give it back in the way, that's the way I give it back. And it's really, like I said, just really journals of really interesting things I'm reading, and I'm researching about American culture and historical figures and things that happened in the past, and present them now in the present, but then projecting into the future. And so the collages kind of happened for me. Those are two on the left. I consider these like studies. I started making these maybe in 2016, a little bit before, but right when, definitely when Trump got in office, because I hit like a really deep depression, not just because of Trump, just because the whole just society. It was a lot. It was a really heavy time for me, and again, I was questioning why am I doing this, you know? And so, and I think it's important question for artists to ask, like, why am I doing this, and what do I want to say, and how does this work impact the community, or how do I even want to do that? And so that got me on my funk, because I started collecting soul records, and I started to go to all these record stores all over the city, you know, going through the dollar bins, and that was like really easing my mind, spending 3 or 4 hours going through records, and it really expanded my music vocabulary as well, because I started like listening to bluegrass and country and just stuff that I would never probably throw in my repertoire, because I was getting these covers and creating these original narratives from, you know, something that already existed, which to me like kind of just really went back to hip hop and the idea of sampling, you know, taking something already existing that we know very well and then making something new out of it. But what's great about music is it's just so many lost dreams or records in the record stores that we never heard. And so I'm looking through a dollar bin like, wow, man, these artists really put their heart and soul into this record, and it's in a dollar bin. And some were people we recognized because there was just too many of them. But some people it just never hit. It just never made the mark in the music world like they wanted to. But I kind of give it a chance to kind of relive through the work in a way. So I'm taking these albums I never heard, but they got interesting covers, and then now I'm making a narrative, and now that might have been somebody's favorite record though. So while it might be a minor character to me, that might be something major to the viewer. And so I love how different people pull from different things in the collages, because it just depends how old you are, your music knowledge, you know. But I try to make the main characters people that really were important to me. Like, you know, I think you can't really see it, but the one that left was like Teddy Pendergrass and Isaac Hayes, and like it's like these guys who I grew up listening to. And so it's kind of cool to give them another narrative and tell different stories through the images, and then through like just kind of cutting into the collages and kind of give them those layers. And what I love about this too was just so much things that don't get to make it to the surface that's underneath that. And it used to kind of bother me because I used to try to keep very key images for like the surface level, but it just didn't work out that way. And it's kind of like life, you know, there's so much history there and so many things you can't really keep up top. It just has to be buried. And sometimes it's buried because it's a painful memory, or sometimes it's buried because, you know, it's just life and you got to keep moving. And so the middle piece was kind of, it's called Man vs. Man. It was really dealing with a lot of things, but Albert King is the centerpiece of that piece. And Albert King was Prince's mentor. And so he was a guy that Prince looked up to, and he's well known to me, but in popular culture, he's not that well known. But Prince was, of course, like this mega superstar that came from this original, this man's music. So I also think about like ancestry and lineage and like, you know, people who I'm inspired by, and kind of like, you know, just people building off giants and standing on their shoulders and what happens with that. And so like, yeah, you have sculptures in that piece, and I have a reference to Keith Haring and Grace Jones. It's like all this kind of, you know, I was in Pittsburgh as well. So I was really thinking about what am I making here in Pittsburgh in relationship to like who is the main artist in Pittsburgh? And that's like Warhol. And so my practice is already dealing with like printmaking and silk screening, but I was just really trying to just kind of be experimental and push those materials along and see what would happen and see like, you know, what can be made there. And that's kind of was the result of it. And I love going out to Pittsburgh because when I go there, I really just go to one place. I go to a residency called Air, and they give me the whole building because it's not a lot of people accessing that space for some reason. It's my favorite place in the world. I go there, they have a shower, they have a futon, and I just lock myself in there and make work. And it's a really kind of interesting time because Pittsburgh is a city that's built on bridges and intersections, but they don't really intersect either. So it's weird because Houston is the largest. I mean, it's more spread out, but I think we navigate our city differently because we have to go across town to go to an exhibition or go to dinner. And so for me to navigate the city I was used to it from Houston. So I went everywhere there, and they was like, man, we see you everywhere. Why are you doing this? Or how are you doing this? I'm just like, it's just so normal in Houston to do this that I didn't think I was like making this like exerted effort to be seen. I was just interested in what was happening, and it was really pretty close. I would look at the GPS like, hey, okay, that's right over the bridge. But then somebody would tell me, man, we don't go over the bridge. Like if it's not in this neighborhood, we don't go. And so when I was at Air, we created a body of work and also curated a show where we was going to open up the show in every neighborhood, in the gallery in every neighborhood, so nobody would have to have this excuse like I'm not crossing the bridge to see the show. So therefore, the show will open up in every neighborhood, the same work, and so everybody got to see it. So that hasn't happened yet, but it's on the way. Just always we're dealing with funding here. But
thank you so much, Robert. Yeah, thank you so much. I hate to cut you off, really, but yeah, thank you so much for shedding light and sort of some of the references. It truly is. Every one of your pieces, I feel like, is an education and cultural literacy. That there are so many places like you have these ideas, but you weave together all these references, and then the viewer can create all of these narratives and stitch them together in so many different ways. And so we just so appreciate the energy and the insight that you've brought to the exhibition.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for having me. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. It was really awesome.
Thank you.
You want me to talk about this one? Is my time up?
I think we got to hand it
They go
off.
so quick. I feel like I talked like for 2 seconds. It's really strange to have 10 minutes. But thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, next up, thanks, Robert. Next up is Mr. Matt Manalo. And then just sort of very briefly, Matt's work for Steven and I sort of was important to think about including in this exhibition because we were struck about how his work really, truly across media so deftly and deeply engages very complex issues about borders, colonial histories, displacement, and then the sort of very personal experience of a first-generation immigrant. Matt's work across media sort of broadly explores the construction of personal identity and place, not often depicting bodies in his work, but certainly including very direct references to the body. And then Matt, of course, is also a very active community organizer in Houston and runs a community-based alternative art space called A-Leaf Art House. And Matt also founded the artist group, Filipinx Artists of Houston. So in this sort of larger vein of his work, the colonization of the Philippines, Matt's home country, is a frequent topic within his work. And we were really grateful to be able to sort of include a cross-section of your work, Matt, in this exhibition, which explores a lot of these ideas. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the show, Steven and Tyler. Yeah, I mean, I'm truly honored to be part of it. A lot of the artists that I'm showing with are artists that I look up to, and it's just an incredible space to be in. Most of my work really talks about the erased history of the Philippine and the Philippine-U.S. relationship. In the history books in the Philippines and here in the U.S., it always talks about how, we are two nations that have a great relationship together, but then there's always that erased part of the history where we were actually colonized and taken advantage of by, you know, imperialism and colonization. You know, a lot of my works are always almost done in a way, you know, more personal, kind of like self-portrait way. And all of the surfaces that I use or that you see in my work are always connected to the skin. So for the oldest piece in the show, which is the one on the left side of the picture that you're seeing, this is called the color of my skin. You know, this piece was made in 2016, and one of the things that I wanted the viewer to have that feeling or that urge to touch the work, because of the amount of work that I've put onto the surface of the piece. I wanted to talk about the violence of being a person of color living here in the United States, especially for Black folks and brown, you know, folks like myself, and just basically surviving and just navigating in spaces where white supremacy still exists. And if you look closer into the piece, you'll see, you know, tearing, picking, or shaving, and you know, and I wanted to show that or symbolize that, you know, that fear that being a person of color exists almost every day, and that kind of stress that it puts into just, you know, living our daily lives. And then for the piece on the right, Forgetting My Skin is a Ruin. It is a piece that hangs on the wall, which is composed or put together with rice bags. Rice is a staple for us Filipinos, and it's something that we also largely export to other countries while, you know, folks in the Philippines are getting hungry. And the words "Forgetting My Skin is a Ruin" is borrowed from a good friend who's a poet in the Bay Area. Her name is Eileen Tabios, and you know, a short story about the poetry that she wrote is that, so she has a series, you know, of making a list of things that she forgetting, and this particular piece really struck me, and it's basically talking about how there is evidence that there's proof of trauma just by looking or just by experiencing, you know, our lives as people of color. And then this piece, Body as a Colonized Vessel, it's a sculpture where I also, again, is using rice bags, but then in this particular piece, I'm using the rice bags as a vessel or as a body. There's another version of this piece, or like another way that it is installed, where the rice bags are just stacked on top of each other until it reaches my height. You know, I'm not a very tall person, but you know, all of them are supposed to be stacked together, and this is an alternative way of showing the piece. And it has the words "colonial mentality" spray painted on the rice bags. The dirt that you're seeing is dirt found in the location where it is being displayed at. So thinking about displacement and also thinking about having the right of place, or that whole idea of reclaiming the land, and also thinking about like the body as a landscape. And, you know, because I am Filipino, and we were colonized greatly by Spain, Japan, and the US, we are left severely traumatized and having a colonial mentality. So I think I'm thinking of the sack being my body, and then the dirt inside as kind of like that decolonized version of myself, the natural self before all of this has happened. Um, um, and for this piece, I added emergency blankets to talk about the the horrific things that is happening in south of the border of Texas, where children are being separated from their families, and that's also the reason why they're stacked shorter, kind of like a way to remember these young lives that are lost from being separated from their families. And also, a little bit of a personal thing. The words "a colonial mentality" is actually something that that happened to me in fourth grade. I was chosen by my class to recite this essay, which started with the words "a colonial mentality." Unfortunately, I got stage fright, and I just kept repeating the words, probably 5 and 6 times, until I just got really embarrassed, and then I walked off the stage. I think that's one of the memories that I remember. In a way, it opened my eyes to thinking about what colonial mentality meant, and it was really hard for me to understand it back then, because it's almost like you're in a space where everyone thinks the same, so you probably don't think that there's anything wrong about it. And then this piece is one of my newer works. It is a found drum. I use a lot of reclaimed objects in my practice, and I also think that being a first-generation immigrant and being or including social practice into my own work, I've kind of like thought about sustainability and how that plays into my personal process of decolonization. So with this piece, exotification of a marked skin, I'm talking about the unfortunate story of a painted prince whose name is Prince Giolo. He was a richly tattooed man from the Philippines, and he was kidnapped by an English explorer named William Dampier, which happened in 1690. He was then brought to England, and then he was exhibited throughout the whole city, publicly and privately, and then he eventually died of smallpox in Oxford the following year. He was enslaved, and then he was eventually freed, but then he eventually died. And then another kind of weird story that I wanted to show with this piece is that that the painted prince, or Prince Giolo, was heavily tattooed, and his tattoos were done in a traditional way of tattooing, which we call batok. And then when he died, they took off his skin and actually displayed it in the Oxford College, which is kind of sad, and something happened also in 2019, which is like pre-pandemic. I was just walking around the Manalo collection, and in their witnesses collection, I found a print of Prince Giolo, like a portrait of him. And automatically I got excited because in a way we are represented, or we are rooted in the institution that we, us in the art world highly revere as like one of the best art, museums in Houston or even the world. And so, I got in contact with the Manil, trying to see, so hopefully we could develop some kind of programming, talking about Prince Giolo, and maybe in a way also possibly give him some kind of proper burial, because us Filipinos, we believe that when we are buried, that our body has to be intact. So when somebody died and their skin was taken off and out of curiosity or out of scientific curiosity, then I find it really sad for him, and hopefully having to develop a programming with the Manil would kind of like bring his spirit to peace. And so this is one of the pieces that I'm trying to make, and where I'm building a series of fake artifacts from the Philippines, but then also putting in the idea of making Filipino American or Filipinos who are based in the US kind of artifacts. So yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. And please keep us posted about the possibility of working with the Manalo, so we can share and learn more about that as it comes to fruition too.
Yeah, I will. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matt. And I have to say, I almost want to apologize to Matt because we weren't able to get sort of all of the layers and narratives and references onto the labels into the exhibition. But I kind of feel privileged because now we get to share these stories that Matt has told us, with our audience, and they are just such generators of conversation. There are so many layers to this work. So both apologies and thank yous to Matt for contributing these works to the show.
Thank you.
We are now in the final four, so I implore you to please stay with us for the final four artists of the evening. And I have the pleasure of introducing Gerardo Rosales, who was one of the first artists I met when I came to Houston, and he had a beautiful exhibition up at TransArt, including a number of sort of monumental paintings and a number of sculptures. And since then, Gerardo has shown his work. We've seen it at the Galveston Art Center. He is presently an artist in residence at the Lawndale Art Center, and now has an exhibition on view, very impressive. And what I'm always struck by Gerardo is that he's such a warm, generous, kind person. And you are drawn to his work with this sort of folk color aesthetic that's charming and inviting. And then when you get close to it, Gerardo shares with you sort of very unsettling stories of trauma and legacy that complicate the work and make it richer and more difficult at the same time. And so we have the opportunity to just learn about a few of the pieces, but I also encourage you to go see more of his work and see it at Lawndale. But for tonight, Gerardo, I turn the microphone over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Steven and Tyler, for the opportunity and to show my work at Blaffer. And thank you, everybody who is sharing, the space with us at the moment. Yeah, I probably should start talking about my work. Telling you that my work comes like from the perspective of being a Venezuelan who emigrated to the US, but it have a very strong impact as well of my experience of growing up as a gay man in the 80s and 90s and experiencing violence, or brutal violence against the gay community, and also being victim as well of the gun violence in Caracas, which was one of the reasons I decided to leave Venezuela to study abroad as well, but because the violence. So in the work that I produce, it has a very strong connection with folk art aesthetics that I saw in Venezuela as I was growing. And I was very interested about how that type of style of art was seen like a less important in the context of the visual arts. We have as well a very strong colonial problems, and there is this kind of chain of styles that are connected to, I guess, from the minorities of people that have less access to education in the visual arts, the tradition of or the legacy of the European Western art is being more respected. So I decided to carry on using, this approach of creating work in connection with this folk art aesthetic, to call it from some way, just because it's always, this type of work is always being seen like kind of decorative and something that don't reflect any type of problems. And then it was a very good vehicle to infiltrate these issues that I was interested in, as I said, violence and issues of inequality, social inequalities, and gender violence and things like that. In the work that you're seeing at the moment, Eggshell, for example, it is a very interesting pieces over there that I create with ceramics, just to bring as well this idea of the fragility of the material. And there is some mix as well of violence and sexuality, and this type of approach to create something that was playful as well. Something like the idea to create like a Lego type of thing, and people could just play with the pieces. But in this case, it's ceramic. This is a little bit more delicate to play. The paintings, if we can have a chance to see the paintings, the painting in particular, the one in the center, is called Gardenlandia. It is a response of problems that I just, when I moved to the US, I saw problems of mass shooting and violence in the schools and all these terrible tragedies. And that war is in connection to that kind of events. And again, I'm using over here this type of shapes and colors that are more, it seems to be more celebratory. But then when I guess I use this type of idea of painting and using this type of colors to attract the attention of the audience as well, and just to kind of like a flower when they try to attract the attention of the insects. And then all this colorful and all this type of celebratory imagery. Then when the person get closer, start like kind of discovering other situation that is not expected. So in one moment, people think it will be like more like something in connection with children illustration stories, but then there is other situation that is more in connection with violence and with the fragility of the body. So
we also have the animation, Gerardo.
Yeah, the animation was a very interesting piece that I did, evoking my experience when I went to a military boarding school for my secondary level, and I was like always that experience created a very strong impact in me, and I was remembering all these type of drills that we did to create this type of discipline, in us, in the students. And I always found out those drills like a waste of time, really, but it was this intention as well to create, you know, like a kind of people that would follow instructions blindly in a way. And I just didn't as well responding to the situation, the current situation in Venezuela, where the military have taken so much power to control society. And so it is very central with the idea of a male, you know, in weapons, in sharp objects, with the intention to control the more vulnerable people in society. So that's basically, you know, the intention with this animation.
Thank you so much, Gerardo. We so appreciate it.
Thank you.
And now I'm going to hand it over to Tyler to introduce our next artist.
Thank you, Gerardo. Our next artist is Sarah Sudhoff, and Sarah's works are some of the few actually works in the exhibition that have a sort of direct reference to the pandemic and to COVID-19. Steven and I wanted to include sort of two major works of Sarah's in the exhibition. One is a series of 8 photographic self-portraits that she made in the early days of the pandemic that I'll let her tell you a bit more about. And the other is a 5-minute version of a 30-minute endurance-based performance where Sarah pays homage to the 42-year-old healthcare worker, Deidre Wilkes, who was one of the first healthcare workers, I think, to die in the very early days of the pandemic. She's also the mother of a young 4-year-old child. And in the work here that we see in this image, actually, Sarah sort of has found a way to pay homage, is how Steven and I have interpreted in many ways, in thinking of a way to find a kindredness with healthcare workers who are experiencing true trauma in their own right. And then also as well, Sarah certainly is foregrounding the importance of motherhood in her own practice. So I'll let Sarah discuss a little bit more. Thanks very much for joining us, Sarah.
Thanks so much for having me. Oh, I didn't know which one we were going to start with. For the last 15 years, my work has interwoven themes of gender, science, and personal experience. I have a photojournalism background and am primarily a photographer and a video artist. And for many years, I worked for magazines. And then when I was living in New York, went back to school. And I still operate within sort of those photojournalism confines. But as an artist, I can explore more fully my ideas from different perspectives, which allows me to be a performance artist as well. And so, as you mentioned, yes, this was in direct response to that young nurse who was one of the first victims of one of the first frontline workers who was a victim of COVID-19. And when I learned about her passing and that she was found dead at home with her young daughter by her side, it was so overwhelming for me as a single mother of 2 young children who were sheltering in place in isolation from COVID. And I immediately thought about my children, and if I became ill, who would take care of me? And if I passed away, how long would it take someone to find me? And then, how long would my children have to sit with my body? And in that moment, I taped up emergency information in our house, how to call for help, how to get out of the house, and showed my children, what to do. And so when I learned about this tragic story, yes, I wanted in part to honor her life and the life of others, but also to recognize what all of us were going through, especially the mothers. And so this performance was both a personal and a universal experience of the pandemic. And so originally I'd asked my 2 children if they would lie on my chest because I felt this unbearable weight and anxiety that was happening prior to this information of learning of this nurse's death and then as a result of. And my children did lay on me, but they didn't want to be part of the performance. And I remembered I had these bricks in my side yard. And so with the help of a friend, we continued to place them on my chest until I couldn't breathe. And the original performance was only about a minute long because the bricks were placed very precariously on my chest, and we did a few images. And but then I've since then redone the performance a few times, and the version that is showing at the Blaffer is a 5 minutes segment of a 30-minute performance. And in that performance, it was very challenging to do it for that long. And when the bricks were removed from my chest, I started to cry, which you can sort of see in the performance, because even though the bricks were removed, I could still feel the pressure. And it made me reflect on the fact that even when the pandemic is over, we will have all been impacted in some way. And that will linger on for who knows how long. And then this work, you know what, you're gonna have to excuse me. I'm gonna have to get my charger. My computer's about to die. So hold on, I'll be right back because I don't want it to cut off.
No problem. Just very briefly, I wanted to mention too that in that sort of intersection, you see where Sarah's video was located in the exhibition. It was adjacent to j.bilhan's photographs. You can't quite see it. Oh yeah, right there you can. And then also with Dario Robletto's sculpture. And Steven and I were trying to think too about what does it mean to sort of visualize these sort of underlying emotions, as well as psychological mind aspects as depicted through the body.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, of course.
I just happened to notice the low battery. And then in this work which was made, so the 60 pounds of pressure was made first. And then I made this also a durational performance of a different kind called Will You Hug Me Forever? And I lived in New York for 7 years, and I still have family and friends there. And unfortunately, I had several friends in New York who contracted COVID, them and their children. And an extended family of mine also passed away from COVID. And so it was after learning of this news that I decided to do this performance. The performance was in honor of family and friends, and it was also in honor of all the healthcare workers who were putting their lives at risk to keep us safe. And at the same time, I wanted to also mark or reflect on my personal experience in isolation with my children. I felt both trapped in isolation, but also very lucky that I was relatively safe. And so I chose to wear a PPE mask for 8 hours, the average workday, the average school day. And so I wore this mask while I went about my normal everyday activities, laundry, cooking, helping the kids with school, going on a walk, a luxury we have here in Texas, not so much in New York. And again, this is back in the early stages of the pandemic. This is in March. And I wanted to honor what was happening, reflect, mark time, and also process what was happening. And the performance and these images were made for myself first and foremost. And it wasn't until institutions and galleries started putting out calls looking for COVID-related work that these images and these performances actually entered into the public space. But during the performance, I had my camera set up actually in my bedroom. I was working with what was on hand. There was no studio. The same for the brick piece. And I took one picture every hour, removed the mask just to show the marks and the imprint on my face, and then placed the mask back on and went about my day. And you know, in recent years, I've been really interested in or a return to self-portraiture and performance and the body as a site of material, and also thinking about my role in a performance, the audience's role in the performance, and then the emotions that I'm willing to share. And in both works, you can actually see me crying. So at hour 6 in Will You Hug Me Forever, and at the end of the performance in 60 Pounds of Pressure.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And And as Tyler mentioned, I think it was really important for us for Sarah's work because it showed us sort of like her direct response, the immediacy in some ways of COVID and sort of its current impact. And now I turn to introduce the next artists who were important for us and for this show because they provided such insightful and valuable sort of documents and details of past epidemics and past ways that mass sort of trauma has infected and inflicted populations. It's an honor to introduce Nick Vaughan and Jake Margolin, who are truly two of the most articulate and eloquent artists that I've met. And they are in the midst of a wildly ambitious project of unearthing sort of unheralded queer histories that live in every state within the United States. And I've had the great pleasure of seeing them perform at the Houston Public Library and at Diverse Works. And just to see that the way that they've documented and traced queer histories in great moments of celebration after the Stonewall riots, and then what happened during the AIDS crisis, and really connecting these moments in history and connecting them to the current moment. And so we could truly listen to them for hours, but we have the opportunity right now for 10 minutes just to get a little bit of their thinking around sort of one of the most current works and then tracing back the lineage through some past works. So I will now hand it off to Nick and Jake.
Thanks. In the spirit of what you just said, we're liable to go on forever, so we've set ourselves a little alarm, and we'll see if in this brief amount of time we can undermine your saying that we're articulate. This piece that we're looking at is the most recent in a series of these spray pieces that we've made over the last decade, in which we've stood on a canvas and sprayed ourselves with a series of evocative colors, and then preserved the canvas as a remnant of that performance. And we made a performance like this several years ago for the University of Houston's Countercurrent Festival for their 10 Tiny Dances. And we did a suburban palette of colors. And we were asked to, is that true?
Yeah, it was the colors, citing colors from a cul-de-sac outside of Fort Collins, Colorado.
It's true.
Which dealt with, it was sort of from another body of work that dealt with our ambivalence towards the mainstreaming of queer culture and gay marriage, specifically as a gay married couple, and just what all of that meant. Anyhow, that was that piece.
So this year during the pandemic, Countercurrent invited us to reprise that piece. And we were like, cool, we'll do it again. And then as soon as we started to work on it, we started to realize that making the pieces we had made, it couldn't possibly work now, in part because the piece requires wearing an N95 mask while we're performing. And this instrument, this piece of protective equipment, had become so astoundingly evocative during this current pandemic that there was no way to read what we had been doing. And we started to think how much this piece and this process felt resonant to thinking about past pandemics and thinking about the AIDS crisis in particular. And so we made this piece, and I'm very struck, I was struck as we were doing it and felt quite emotional about it, is how much this hot pink winds up feeling like blood in this piece, which in previous works it hadn't, but it just felt like our bodies were coming out.
Well, it's also a much more focused piece in terms of performance. So the previous pieces had all been about 1 hour long, not excluding the Countercurrent one. And this is this was 5 minutes. And so it was very directly just in thinking about pandemics and thinking about political action, thinking about the AIDS crisis. It was very specifically, there were sort of 3 sections of aiming the paint at each other's hearts, at each other's crotches, and at each other's feet, in this sort of like spirit, sex, activism thing. That is what left that print.
I think we'd better move on to another thing.
So this is actually, it's been really nice to be part of this show, also because so much of thinking about framing our work, we think about history, and we think about history and identity and how we relate to history and how contemporary communities relate to queer history. and readdressing and just sort of looking back at our work and realizing how much the body has always been central. And certainly in the cut maps, which are what is represented upstairs, they started with bodies. So they started very early on with this incredibly politically problematic, socially problematic show called The Bodies Exhibit, which I think now is like back at the museum in Houston. It's totally messed up. It's worth its own spiral on the internet. But there was one room that was the human vascular system and pulmonary system excised from the rest of the body. And seeing that as this, like, we had started being interested in maps, but looking at these things, it suddenly felt like, oh, these are just maps. These are networks. They're river networks. They're communication networks. And so we started cutting out maps to sort of try and get at the vascular system of these geographies, and ultimately started laying over these queer iconographies, asserting this corporeal connection between the iconography and these sort of cultural histories and the landscapes that we use to define ourselves. So this one in particular, no, let you jump in.
This piece here is called The Scene, and it's the centerpiece in a broad project that we made that was about the Houston drag scene in the years between Stonewall and the beginning of the AIDS crisis, which since Nick and I moved to Houston in 2014, has been a part of the city's history that we've gotten to hear about again and again and again, and keeps on coming back to how vibrant and politically active and incredibly important this period was, and in particular these drag performers were. When we first moved here, we were introduced to Ray Hill, who was a great raconteur, but also a great political lion in the queer rights movement and in the prison rights movement. And when we met him, he said, let's go meet at Mary's Naturally, which was sort of like the Stonewall of Houston. It was a bar, a gay bar, that was a hub of community activism where a lot of the political planning was done. And he says, now a coffee shop. We'll go there and we'll get a cup of coffee. And when we told Nick's aunt, who's a photographer in town, Janice Rubin, that we were going there, she was like, I've got somewhere these photographs I took of a drag show in the backyard of Mary's in 1976. And I'm going to find them. And she pulls them out of her archives and she shows us these photographs, and you'll see there in the bottom corner of the map the image of the young drag queen screaming at the camera, and she's dressed as Wonder Woman. And from that moment on, we knew that we wanted to at some point make a cut map compilation of these drag queens. And so this is a combination of amateur drag queens like that one, who we come to find out is a performer named J.J. Farmer, who passed away during the crisis, and other amateur drag queens, all the way to some of the most famous drag queens in the United States at the time, Mr. Tiffany Jones,
Naomi Sims.
And maybe we should move on to the next one.
So these two, well, they're from two different bodies of work. So the one on the right, the pageant crown, actually came from that same body of work that was addressing the importance of drag in the years between the Stonewall riots and the onset of the AIDS crisis within Houston's political scene and cultural scene, and just the people who literally were at the front of the lines, putting their bodies out there in the most visible way, in the most vulnerable way, and also in the most inspiring way, to talk to people about what the drag shows meant to them, and also what the queens meant to them in terms of getting them through the crisis. And so this was a pageant crown that we photographed at the Gulf Coast Archive and Museum, where we did a lot of research for that project. This is one of the pageant crowns that's in their collection. And so we photographed that and backed it with video of a flare at a refinery down in Texas City, that just somehow gets at like the innate power and force and energy that sort of defined the scene in those years, and also the destruction and the loss and the I think two of the queens in the larger 8-part map survived the AIDS crisis.
And this last piece is from a series of work that we've done of these pinups that use images from vintage gay erotica. I think these were from Physique Pictorial. And these were asserting that this connection, these positive images of powerful, happy, virile gay men, which was such a rare thing to see for so many decades, is an innate part. It has a corporeal, deep body connection to our sense of who we are and where we're from, and these
for
landscapes.
A long time was the only positive image that people had access to in the community. So
I think we're at time.
Yeah, we'll finish with that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nick and Jake. We so appreciate your insights and your reflections and everything you've brought to this project.
Thanks also, everyone. Again, we're now on our last artist, last certainly, but certainly not least. Jasmine, thanks for joining us. Just very briefly, I first encountered Jasmine's work, I think, relatively recently while driving along Washington Avenue at maybe, I think in either late 2019 or early 2020, Jasmine, where she had made a series of murals paying tribute to Naomi Polk. Jasmine's work has also been seen recently in many different places, including at Project Row Houses and at Discovery Green, as well as a mural at Rice University, which I think is still on view. Broadly, Jasmine's practice is inherently informed by her experience as a first-generation Honduran American woman and artist. And Jasmine, as we'll see in some of these images, Jasmine frequently references iconic or religious portraiture that explore then complex themes of identity, gender, and race. Her works are often embellished through this sort of laborious process of ornamentation or decoration, and we'll see that in just a little bit. And her often, I think majority of the time, female characters shimmer with this very sort of wonderful, complex, visceral tension. And they often gaze back upon us as viewers with various degrees of intimacy, anxiety, or emotion. We also see vintage patterns of floral elements in Jasmine's works. And for the flowers, they often, I think, reference, they act as both a sort of universal symbol of growth, certainly, and beauty, and then also a very sort of subtle nod to a familial narrative that I will let you discuss if you'd like. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. We're so thrilled that you're here.
No, thank you. Thank you for including me. How do I follow up on all these amazing artists? It's hard. Well, I guess my work, like looking at these, I'm exploring themes of identity and the body as a vessel for personal narrative and identity. And maybe I'm getting older, but I've been thinking a lot about how my body is experienced, like how it feels while I'm painting. And like the discomfort I'm putting myself in, sort of like behind the scenes of like in this one specifically on the Verge, there's sort of like large gestural movements that I started to think about once I started painting murals, how much my body is involved in the mark making and making the paint do what I want it to. But also even the little ones, like applying rhinestones like over and over, you know, it's like I'm hunched and my body is really tense. But yeah, I've been thinking about my body and how the after effects of that are, but sort of the body also as a vessel. I'm a brown woman, and so I am interested in painting brown and darker skin tones, brown and black, because I feel like I didn't really see that represented much as I was growing up. And so it's really important to me to use that, you know, as a really important element in my work and exploring themes of identities. So like in most of my work, I'm removing facial features. It's the emphasis is more on the eyes and the skin tone. And so what are the eyes telling me? Like with these red, watery eyes, it's about the underlying tensions and sort of obscuring the faces. So I'm being selective about what I'm choosing to show. Some of these are from an ongoing series of wallflower paintings. I am a wallflower by nature, so I would like to like hide my body, like, or just kind of escape the focus. And so I feel like that comes out in these, looking at them in this way where it's almost hiding behind these masks that are obscuring the faces. Tyler, you kind of were talking about the personal narrative of the flowers and the like iconography of that. And I like, when I look at these, I see like my mother, I see my sister, I see my nieces, and we're all named after flowers. And so I see them as these sort of like sacred objects and familial and biological. And I'm really interested of that imagery at play with the figurative work, and also executing it in a way that's sort of, I don't know, looser and less tight and controlled. So it's almost like cartoony. I used to try to paint really realistically, and I think I go through phases of drawings that are realistic, but this is kind of more fun and keeps me interested. Maybe we should look at some of the next ones.
You know, I think that somehow one of the slides got cut off. I think this is the last image that we had.
This is it. Okay. Well, I mean, I guess I'm thinking of just identity, essentially, skin identity, and the search thereof, or omitting identity. My parents are from Honduras, and I grew up kind of like between both worlds of being the daughter of immigrants, you know, like knowing one world and then sort of being a part of American culture as well. And the tension of those two sort of not really finding a happy medium, like trying to belong to both worlds and not really belonging to either. So yeah, I think that's.
I wonder if you could just very briefly tell us a bit about just in the images we've seen here, and then I'm sorry we don't have there are two other really fantastic works that everyone needs to come and see in the next week. But this sort of use of embellishing through this glitter, or the sort of beautifying in a certain sense, these sort of aesthetic choices that then become this sort of reflective, pretty object that it is performing or presenting. And I wonder, you know, if you could speak a bit about how and why, and this sort of process-based nature of adding these things.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that's a good one. I think about ritual, and I'm interested in how we can sort of modify our outward appearances and how that makes us feel. So growing up, my sister was a chola, and I would sit there and watch her apply her L'Oreal mascara, just like in this really intimate act, you know, and I was just a total creeper, but I mean, I was fascinated by it, and how that makeup that she was applying was really strong and fierce and the opposite of soft. So I'm fascinated by the idea that we can sort of manipulate our outward appearances into something that is not the norm or challenges what we see, what's the norm of you know, what's feminine and what's not. And so when I'm applying the glitter and the tiny little rhinestones, to me, that's sort of like maybe an homage to that. It's ritual. It's each little part, you know, each little rhinestone that I'm applying with the tweezers, like I mentioned earlier, like my body is really like, is uncomfortable. I do well with repetitive and meticulous tasks like that, but I think everything that I'm sort of like thinking and feeling and what I'm listening to is going into that, you know. It's like, it's really about ritual and this like subtle beauty. I think these pieces with the rhinestones and the glitter, like they read differently on screen when you're in front of them. I mean, there's this like subtle luminosity that you wouldn't really see unless you're kind of like engaging with it. So walking past it, or you know, from across the room. And that was something that I really enjoyed, specifically in the room with Francis and Violette. how they work together and how they speak together. So when you're looking at one object and, you know, out of the corner of your eye, you're still engaging with the other works as well. And I really appreciate that.
Lovely. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to everybody
Yeah,
hanging in there.
and I want to thank everyone. We are truly grateful to artists and audience and everyone who has spent 2 hours plus tonight with us. Really, this was such a, we are so grateful and appreciative to all of the artists for sharing their stories and references and the architecture, all of these pieces. And thank you, audience, for being here with us. I'm not sure we should take questions. I think everyone sort of like has spoken. And so maybe if I just have the opportunity, I just want to sort of an observation that I made. I think that with Jasmine's work, we have the agony and the ecstasy sort of combined into one. You see the seduction of the sparkle, and then you approach these pieces and there's these red sort of distressed eyes. And it got me thinking in terms of like wrapping this up, sort of the bookends of the show. And when you walk into the lobby, you hear the vacuum sort of noise in Ryan Hawk's video, and you have this soundtrack of alarm and distress signals in Nick and Jake's piece. And it sort of sets a certain tenor to the exhibition of a state of alarm, you know, and of something sort of imposing. And then by the time we get to the end of it on the second floor, we have Sarah's breath in that performance piece, 60 pounds of pressure. It's a traumatized, it's an injured, it's a labored breath, but it's a continuation of the breath and of someone still breathing. And I think for me, that's what strikes me at the end of Carriers, is that we get to this place where we will survive. We will get through this. It's been an incredibly difficult experience, but we're so grateful to all the artists for in so many ways helping us through this. You know, I think that this has been an incredibly meaningful exhibition for Tyler and myself and everyone that has encountered this. So I just want to end tonight with thanking all of you. It's truly been profound and poignant, and I'm so grateful.
Thanks,
And
everyone.
just quickly everyone that's signing off, Tyler and I are going to come back Wednesday night and speak with Rachel Affey Quinn, who's an incredible professor in comparative cultural studies and women's gender and sexuality studies. That dialogue will take place at 6 o'clock. We're kind of doing a grand hurrah of public programs for the last week of Carriers. So if you still want to hear more from us, please tune in Wednesday night. And yes, thank you again. This talk is recorded. It will be on our YouTube page. So please, if anyone who couldn't make it tonight, you can access this. And we are so thankful that this can be part of our archives.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank y'all. Good night.
You. Bye.
Amazing talk. It was great. All of you.
Thanks, Rona.